In this video, I'm going to start adding more paint and grunge detail to the hammer. I'll do some of that using generators and some of that just painting with alphas. I did notice, however, that on the top part here, top plastic part of the handle, the generator that was used to create the mask for the paint is making it a little bit too even here. So I'm going to go back to that layer, which is this one, and I'm going to go to the paint layer there and start painting out some of that. So I'm going to go to my brushes. I'm going to make sure that I'm set to black and I'll choose this dirt brush and start painting that out so that there's a little bit there, but not a whole lot. And that looks a little bit more realistic now. All right, so to start adding additional paint detail to the whole hammer, I'm going to go up to my top layer, create a new folder. I'll call this Paint and Grunge. And I'll create a new fill later, put that in there. And on this layer, I want to paint color. Height, rough, metallic, no normal. I want my metallic set to black because it won't be metallic. I'm going to set the roughness less rough. I want the paint to just be raised a tiny bit, so I'm just going to increase that to like 0.01, something like that. And I'm going to adjust the base color so that it has a little bit of a color tint to it. Maybe a little bit of an orange. Whatever color you want it to have. All right, so now I'll create a black mask and right click and add generator. And again, do the mask editor. And with this, I want to turn down the opacity, and I want to put a image in here. So I'm going to go to my procedurals, and I'm going to grab one of those grunge textures. I think I'll grab this grunge spot dirty and add that to the texture one. Come up to my texture opacity here, bring that all the way up to 1, and in the tab here I'm going to set the blending mode to normal, and you'll see that starts to come through some. And I'm going to change I'll just let's see, do I want triplanar on or off? I think I want to leave triplanar off, and there's a couple of places that because triplanar is off, the texture is kind of getting stuck at the seam, so I can add a paint layer to try to fix some of that. So I will select mask in, right click, add paint, and choose a brush, and I'm just going to choose a basic hard brush and make that fairly small, and come in and just add in some details along the edges where it feels like some of the texture is getting cut off in a not realistic way. I think that was the only place that actually needed that. All right. So I have one layer of paint detail that's going across the whole thing. You can see that that's kind of adding a little bit more paint splatters across the whole thing. I can go back into my mask editor and play around with settings a little bit. Leave my brightness at 0, can adjust contrast. Oh, I think that's going to be okay. I can go in and adjust global balance. You can see that that's bringing up some of the details on that texture a little bit. And I think that actually is looking pretty good. All right, so I'll call that paint 1. And then probably to start adding some of those other little paint details, instead of adding a generator, I'm going to just start using some brushes and masks to kind of create more unique details. So again, I'll do a fill, turn off normal, make my height just really tiny, set my base color to whatever I want it to be, add a black mask, and this time I am going to choose some different alphas to paint with. So I've got a bunch of different kinds of splotchy paint, so I can come in and make my brush size bigger and paint in some splotches that then can become a little bit more unique across the whole thing. And this is going to be probably the most time-consuming part of the process, to get that overall really kind of realistic feel to the different paint along here. Then if I want to kind of paint out of that, I can change to black and use another brush to kind of paint some of those, make it so it's not quite so even. And then I'll create another fill layer. Let's actually just call this one Paint 2. And again, no normal. Roughness, bring it down. This one I'm gonna have the paint be a little bit reddish and black mask, and do the same thing, add in a few more little paint details to kind of and on this, for the base color, I don't want it to be quite so solid, so I'm going to just bring down the opacity on that a little bit. All right. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more grunge in this area using a generator. So I'm going to create another fill layer, and again, I'm going to have it be a little bit darker of a color. And create another black mask, add a generator and mask generator. And with this, I want to make sure I get the height detail that's in the handle here. So I am going to come into my generator and make sure I use the anchor point that was made for the handle height detail. So I'm going to come into micro details, turn on height, and scroll down to micro height, choose handle height details, and make sure this is set to height. So that now is showing up in there. However, I think I need to invert the mask so it's showing more in the areas of the groove. And I'm going to go back to my procedurals, and under texture 1, I'm going to add in a grungy texture. Maybe something like that. And I'll bring up the opacity on that. And then I'm going to adjust the global balance. And I'm going to set that texture to triplanar. And I'm going to adjust that color. Don't want it to be quite so dark. And I'm also going to, in the mask, increase the ambient occlusion so it's showing a little bit more in those areas. And since I mostly just wanted that showing up in this area, I'm going to add a paint layer to paint out some of that additional detail. I'm actually going to So select the mask, right click, add paint, and I'm just going to grab a basic hard brush and I'm going to, whoops, I want to paint with black. I'm going to paint out most of this. Add a little bit of, undo that. I'm going to change the brush that I was using. So kind of just paint it out anywhere that I didn't want the effect from the generator. Alright, so this is starting to look a lot like our reference, and I would basically just continue on adding more layers until I get it looking exactly the way I want. One thing I might want to add is an additional layer across everything for some just adding roughness detail in here. So I'm going to add in my paint and grunge layer another fill layer, and on this I'm just going to paint roughness detail, and I'm going to bring that to kind of a mid-tone, and again add a black mask and add a generator. And with this, I'm going to just use a dirt generator. And I'm temporarily going to turn on color too, so I can see what this is actually doing. So you can see that this dirt generator has added some dirt across the whole thing that's looking kind of like that. And I can now go into that generator and adjust things like dirt contrast and that's actually looking pretty good. So now I can come back in and just turn the roughness, and you'll notice if I adjust that roughness value, you can see how that additional roughness detail on that generator has added in this extra layer of variation in the shine on the surface, which makes it a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to turn that roughness value down a lot. If I turned it all the way down, you can see that there's some areas that it's just not shiny at all. But I think if we go with something like that, that's going to create just enough roughness variation on the surface to make it a little bit more realistic and interesting. All right, so I'm just going to rename these Paint 3, Paint 4, and Roughness. And again, I could go on, continue tweaking, adding more details, adding additional layers, but at this point, I think I'm going to call this done.